Hello and welcome to the SMU Video Archive Series. In this series, we interview members of the SMU community who can provide insight into the history of SMU, especially from the perspective of their time at the university. I'm Pam Lange, and with us today is the former Director of Housing, Gene Ward. Welcome.
Good to be here.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
And we've enjoyed visiting about your career and your life, and I thought we kind of divide the interview between your memories of being a student at SMU and then your long career here and your career and still going on, actually.
Still going on.
Still going on. You had a family connection to SMU. You want to tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my father was a Methodist minister.
Okay.
And he was transferred to Ferris, Texas, which is about 20 miles south of Dallas.
Yeah.
Back in the early 20s, so he could commute to SMU on the interurban and finish up his bachelor's divinity degree.
Okay.
And he commuted to SMU on the interurban and the streetcar to finish that. And so from that time on, I've been very familiar with SMU. I've come here all my life. Mm-hmm. And later on, as he came back to various meetings, I would come, my mother rather, and I would come. We stayed in Snyder Hall one time, and I was very overcome by the self-service elevator, which I was about 9 years old at the time. Got sick on the elevator. I read it too much.
You just rode up and down.
That's right.
I'm sure they were thrilled.
So later on, when I was director of housing, the students in Snyder Hall used to call it Otis the elevator.
Oh, that's right, Otis the elevator. Yeah, that was funny.
And it was in fact, it was the first self-service elevator in Dallas.
Oh, was it really?
Later, I checked with the Otis company, and they said it was the very first one.
Wow.
And it looked like it.
Now that's gone, I guess, but I think the ones
Well,
in Dallas Hall
I'm sure
are
they've
still.
got a new one in there now. But
Yeah, but you had the very first
But that
one.
was the very first one in Dallas, very first self-service in Dallas.
So your dad, did he stay in Paris, or did you move around like the Methodists?
This is Ferris, not
Oh,
Paris.
Ferris. That's right. I thought Paris is
No,
not
Ferris.
20 miles. Ferris, yeah, I know
No.
that. Okay.
No, he moved all over Central Texas. He was a member of the Central Texas Conference of the Methodist
Okay.
Church. And eventually came up the line, ended up being district superintendent and pastor of Polytechnic Methodist Church in Fort Worth.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Fort Worth was where I graduated from high school, and that's what I've sort of considered my hometown, though we moved around a lot. And he was on the board of trustees at SMU for 27 years.
Wow.
He was chairman of the instruction committee, which hired faculty.
Okay.
While he was,
And I guess-
I've had an association with the school for a long time.
And I guess at that time they really did have a lot to say about the faculty.
Oh,
Yeah, I've looked at
I'm
some
sure
of those
much more so
codes.
than now.
Yeah.
It wasn't as much a rubber stamp organization. as
No,
I'm sure it is now.
and the Methodists were in charge at
That's
that time.
right, they were in charge.
Yeah, your father knew every president then of SMU, even
He knew
Dr.
every president.
Heyer,
I knew everyone except one.
the first.
I did not know Dr. Heyer, but everyone since then I have personally known. And so I've been around here a long time.
You have. You've been at SMU. Well, that's probably about the longest of anyone I've talked to,
True.
that you've been here even as a child
Yeah,
and then to come up. So,
And I saw a lot of the buildings go up. I came here in 1942 as a student, as a freshman. We call them freshmen and not first
that's
year.
right. Did you have to wear a beanie?
I had to wear a beanie. And I lived in Atkins Hall, which is now Clements Hall. I was in room 333.
333.
And that was quite an experience. Coach Roswell Higginbotham was the director, and he and his wife and little boy lived in the building.
Okay.
And we ate in the dining hall for men was in the east basement of Atkins Hall. And they served everything family style. We'd go down for each meal. We had to stand behind our chairs and wait for the director and his wife to be seated.
You're kidding.
And a theology student would say the blessing, and then we would all sit down. And then theology students were the waiters, and they would come out and bring all the food.
Oh, really? So it was just like being it was very formal.
Well,
Did you have to dress? Did you have to wear?
No. On Sunday we had to wear a coat and tie, but any other time we didn't have to.
So that
But-
was the men's dorm. Did you
That-
have rules and regulations at that dorm?
Oh yes.
You did?
Oh yeah, we had hours. We had to be in at 10 o'clock at night, 12 on the weekend. I had a good friend who came in late all the time. And he shinted up one of the columns on the north entrance of Atkins Hall and broke off one of the little scrolls up there, and it's broken off.
Still
to this day.
broken off.
It's still broken off.
Wow.
And he was the son of a Methodist bishop who was also on the board.
Oh, you're kidding.
He'll be unnamed.
So what happened to him when he?
When he got in, he jumped onto the landing of the stairwell, and the coach was standing at the bottom waiting for him. so
that was not the best moment of his life.
That wasn't the best point of entry, but that's the way it was back in
It
those
was.
days. And it had not changed tremendously when I came back to work here. I was amazed.
And that was when you,
I
we'll
came
continue
back-
talking about your
well,
school.
I
but
graduated in 1949, and I started out in the engineering school and found out that calculus was too much for me, among other things. I was one of the many that transferred to the business school.
You changed to, okay, you changed to business.
Yeah. But I graduated in 1949 and had hoped to go to work in Houston for Humble Oil Company. They were a very good company to work for. But this was just, we were having a lot of economic problems in this country at that time.
That's right.
And jobs were hard to come by, and so I went to work for SMU. I had worked as a senior in the business office, and I continued that job, only got a few more duties. And I worked there until 1952, I guess it was, when I had an opportunity to move to Houston.
Oh, so you
And
did
worked
go.
in Houston for 5 years.
What were you doing down there?
Well, I was the chief accountant for a wholesale hardware concern in Houston. But I got to where I didn't really like it. I wanted to get more in with professional people. Mainly teaching school. My mother and father had both taught school in the earlier years, and I was interested in teaching school. So I came back to SMU in 1957. A good friend of mine had been called by Willis State to come back and be the director of housing and assistant dean of students, a fellow named Mac Adams. And Mac and I were close friends. So I called Mac and I asked him if he had a job up here. I work as an RA in the dorm to pay my way, and he said yes, he could take care of that. So I came back in '57.
With your wife. You had a wife by that time?
I didn't have a wife.
You didn't have a
No, I
wife
did
by
not
that
have
time.
a
Okay.
wife. Came back and lived as a resident assistant in Bose Hall for a year. But during that year, I met my wife, the girl to be my wife. I'd always said I'd always wait 2 years before I married any girl. We were married within 8 months.
Oh, really? So much for that. That was
So much for that.
so much for that plan, right?
So then, of course, she moved. We by that time, Mac and his wife moved out, and we moved into the director's apartment, and I became the director of Bose Hall.
I see. So
And
they
she
had a person living there.
Oh yeah,
that
there was a director in every single building.
Okay.
In the men's buildings, it was a couple generally. There were two buildings. There was Bose Hall and Atkins Hall. At that time, Atkins is now Clements Hall.
So that changed. When did that change? Do you remember? Just before? I can't remember. But
In the early '60s. In the early
Okay.
'60s. Bill Clements, our late governor.
that's okay.
He gave the money. Gave the money to refurbish the building,
change it into
and turn it into a classroom building, and they named it after his father, I believe. But
So when you were living in Atkins Hall or Bose Hall, you were the resident director. So you were in charge of.
I was the resident director of Bose.
Bose, okay.
Then about that time, Mac created the job of director of men's housing, and I got that job, and I was over both of those buildings.
Okay, but you didn't live. You still lived there?
But I still lived in Bose. I lived in Bose Hall. My wife and I lived in Bose Hall 5 years.
Wow.
And we lived in McIlvaney Hall for 3 years as directors of that building. But then the women's area, Snyder, Virginia, Shuttles, and Peyton were the four women's halls at that time. Joanne King, Mrs. Joanne King, who had been Dean of Women at Southwestern University, was hired to be the director of women's housing. So she and I, had equal status, and we were under Mr. Adams, who was director of housing.
I see. So what were you to? You were in charge of everything in the house?
Everything. At that time, the housing office operated not only the fiscal management and the physical management, they also the student services.
I see. So there wasn't any like the student services. There wasn't
No,
any
there
kind
wasn't.
of Jim Caswell
We
type
now have an
office.
Office of Residence, Life, and Housing.
That's right.
1963 was a time of big change at SMU. The 60s were a time of change all over
That's right.
the colleges in the United States. SMU did not have all the problems that a lot of schools had, but still the students were demanding more say in what was going on. And at that time, they instituted what they called the master plan,
I remember.
which was both an academic thing as well as administrative changes. And at that point in time, they eliminated the housing office as such.
Oh.
And they gave the programming area, which would be counseling, the programs within the halls for the students, to the Dean of Men and the Dean of Women.
Oh.
And then the physical operation went to an office they called the Office of Special Services. And Mr. Adams left the deanship and went in as director of Office of Special Services.
So what happened to you?
And then Mrs. King became assistant director, and I became assistant director of Special Services.
Oh, so that was
So
a completely
it changed what we did. The way we set it up ultimately, once we got started, she became in charge of all revenue producing. I became in charge of all expense. So I was the one that refurbished the buildings. I was over the housekeeping staff, the maintenance, all of that. She was over publicizing all the halls, trying to get students into the halls. She also operated the conference business.
Oh, okay.
SMU, well, I guess it was back in the early 50s. We had a staff of housekeeping staff in the halls. The food service had all their people. And in the summertime, the SMU's never had a real big summer program.
Mm-mm.
And so they had to set up some kind of conferences in order to keep all these people hired.
That's
you
right.
can't fire them all in May and get them all back in September.
True.
So in order to pay these people, we set up conferences. Well, the cheerleading school was one of the first things they did.
Was it really?
And at one time, I was the director of the cheerleading school.
How did you like that?
So I didn't have to do any cheering, but
good.
I'm the one that made all the arrangements for it.
Okay.
I'm the one that handled all the registration and handled the contract between the university and the National Cheerleading Association. Mr. Lawrence Herkimer,
That's right.
who was a graduate of SMU, he owned the National Cheerleading Association. And so I dealt with him quite a bit. And of course, he's the one that actually taught the school, he and all of his teachers.
They still have that school.
And it's still here.
Very successful.
We were the first one in the nation. And of course, he had schools all over the nation, and then even some parts of Europe, I think. He became very successful at this.
Right, at this cheerleading, because that got to be a big...
At any rate, our office handled that, and I specifically handled that. Mrs. King handled a lot of the other ones. The banking school. We still have the Southwest
That's
Graduate
right.
School of Banking. We
Right.
had a lot of schools. We had what we call the accepted supply pastors. The School of Theology trains people who have not had a chance to get a real college education. There are a lot of ministers out in the hinterlands who
Right.
do not have a college education, and they come every summer. I guess they still do. I don't know.
I think they do. They have
But at the
Ministers'
time,
Week.
they came every summer, and they would be here for about an 8 or 9 week program, and our office handled all of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we did all sorts of things to try to keep
Keep the fires
money
burning.
coming
Keep the
in.
money coming in.
And
So
we
that
had-
was
'cause we
that
had-
the reason for changing everything around, or
No,
was it
I
just the
think-
philosophy?
No, I think the real reason was that the students were demanding more
Okay.
say in what was going on. When I first came back in '57, we still had a lot of the rules that we had back
That's
when I
right.
was a student.
Mm-hmm.
We still had hours on the freshman men. We had hours, I think, on all the women.
Oh, absolutely.
And we enforced them. Of course, the men would gripe about it, but they also sort of appreciated it, because if they were going through fraternity rush,
They had to come
they
back.
did have Hell Week then, though the school never admitted it, but they did.
They did. I know that. Yeah, right.
And so a lot of the time the fraternities would want to keep these students out
All
all night,
night, yeah.
And they said, no, we've got to be back. We'll be
too bad.
penalized. And so the students were really sort of glad to have somebody to fall back on.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't like the rules, but they were happy to be able to tell their fraternity brothers that they couldn't
That
stay
they
out
had
all
to.
night.
So they still had the dress code.
So-
You had to wear certain.
Well, we didn't have a dress code, really.
Well, the girls, I think, couldn't wear
more.
slacks or
Yeah, the
something.
girls couldn't run around in shorts.
That's right.
If the women, if they went to physical education, they had to wear a raincoat or something over their
I
shirt.
know. We had raincoats that came
Yeah.
down to here
Which
with our
is
shorts under them.
ridiculous, but that's the way it was.
Ridiculous. Yeah.
But anyway, we did have those rules. We had something else that, it's hard to think now. When anybody did anything to break a rule, like too much noise or like getting drunk or whatever, we would campus them.
That's right, campused.
And it's hard to believe that we did that then, and the people did it.
They
But
didn't.
we would campus a student, and they had to come down to the desk at the dorm, sign in every hour, on the hour. So they couldn't get more than 30 minutes away.
Isn't that something?
Isn't that something?
It is that you could control, that you could actually prosecute
it seems
all that.
incredible that we were able to do that, but we
It
did.
does, but and I think you could, even going to chapel, you had the mandatory chapel.
Oh, yeah.
And they took roll,
Oh,
and then if you
yes.
didn't go, you got a demerit too.
Yeah,
There was a certain number to get campus.
We have, my wife and I have a friend who went here in the early 30s, and she swore up and down that when she was here, that they made the Episcopalians and the Catholics sit in the balcony. Now, whether that's really true, I don't know.
But you had chapel in McFarland.
We had
Is that
chapel
right?
in McFarland. And really, the meetings were really pretty good. It wasn't religious all necessarily. Sometimes it was, but frequently it was, all kinds of interesting things. So it wasn't terrible.
So when you came back in 1957, the rules were still similar
Well, there
to
was
what
no
they
chapel. The chapel had
no chapel
vanished by then.
Right, but you did have
But
the
we
rules.
still had some rules in the dorms, and of course, the present day generation doesn't like to call them dorms. They're
No,
residence halls.
residence halls. Well, I
But,
think they still call them dorms.
They're still to me. I'm from the old school.
Exactly. So when did all this change?
It started changing in '63.
That's when
When the master plan came into play, and of course that was an academic thing also. They went through and they really changed a lot of the academic programs. That was the real thing that they did. But the students also were demanding more freedom, and that's when our office was created. The dean of men and the dean of women took over. Ultimately, within a few years, they did away with that and created the Office of Residence Life. And the Office of Residence Life worked in conjunction with our office to operate the halls. And they were the ones that were in charge of the directors. When I first came, when I was a student, and then when I first came back in '57, we had hall directors.
that lived there, basically.
We had a couple living, like my wife and I, in our building. Dr. and Mrs. Etzler, he was a German professor. He and his wife lived in Atkins Hall. The women's halls all had mature women
Okay, they did. Yeah, I remember that.
who were the directors of the building, and they were very nice ladies. As my wife and I have looked back on it, our years in the halls, we had three kinds of friends. We had the older women that were in the dorms. We had the students that we needed, and then we had our contemporaries. So
Right.
we had three sets of friends
All the friends
while we were on
and that
campus.
must have been an amazing experience to
It
live
was.
on.
And to this day, we still hear from some of those students.
Isn't that great?
I still get, in fact, we have one student that I hear from about every 2 weeks.
Oh,
Who was
really?
here 40 years ago.
Isn't that
Isn't that
something? So he remembers you. And
Well,
what kind of troubles did you have? Did they, I mean, I know now
Well, of
they'll
course,
trash out everything.
We didn't have problems
Not like,
with drugs then.
No.
Thank heavens.
thank goodness.
Alcohol was our big problem.
Yeah.
And that's what would get more students in trouble than almost anything. But there were all, too much noise, too much
Vandalism,
cheating,
did you?
vandalism,
Right.
this sort of thing. But
And you were supposed to handle that. That was
and
up to you.
And I'll have to say that I guess the things that I enjoyed the most was dealing directly with the students. I thoroughly enjoyed counseling the students. And I think I have a lot of good friends among former students that I counsel with. The students particularly would have trouble with their girlfriends
Oh,
and
yeah.
with their parents,
That's true.
and plus getting into all sorts of other trouble.
Difficult.
I mean, I had to go get people out of jail, and I've
Have
had to
you
take,
really?
And I've had to take. I hate to think how many times I've probably put myself in jeopardy when I would take students to the emergency room, and their parents might be in Europe.
Right, but they were sick.
And
They had
the hospital would do
injured-
nothing until somebody signed
Wow.
to guarantee the payment of the bill, and I did that many times.
But you always, it was
But
okay.
I never had a problem. The parents would come through.
That's good.
But I could have gotten in trouble. So I've been through many things like that with getting people out of trouble. We had, as I didn't have it in my list for you. We had a boy, there were two boys actually. Actually back then, the Majestic and the Palace and the Tower of
That's
the
right,
theaters were all
downtown.
downtown, and these kids, when the movies would let out around 11 o'clock. And these two kids went downtown, and they had a starting pistol, and one of them went up to the Palace Theater, and the other one got the starting pistol out and shot him, and that kid fell on the sidewalk
no.
as if he had been shot. And of course, the whole downtown just erupted, and everybody was screaming, and of course those kids were crazy. They could have been killed. The police could have shot them.
Ridiculous.
So things like that. I mean, I hate to. I really should have kept a diary of all the stuff.
Well, I think you should start now. I mean, you've given me a huge, like 5 pages of closely written memory, and you should, because it's a great
story.
story.
Were mad at me one time in Bozola, and they picked up a Volkswagen and brought it in the building and set it right in front of my door.
Oh, no, that's terrible. But it takes a kind of special person to deal with those kids, doesn't it?
So you have to deal with crazy things like that.
Yeah. So the 60s was kind of the turning point, though. That's when the university
the
changed.
colleges all over the country were churning.
That's right.
I mean, this is the time. All this was going on. The Vietnam War had started. There was a lot of unrest going on within the teenage and early 20s population. And SMU was very fortunate. We didn't really have this change in the master plan thing was part of it, which was very mild. We didn't have all the things that they had up north.
Nobody
We did have a
sit
sit-in in Perkins' administration. Willis State, I think, was the one. He really did know how to handle things like that. I think it could have been much worse had we not had someone like Willis State to have been overseeing the whole thing.
And I know they had a teach-in where nobody taught classes a few days, because I happened to be there at that time. That's right. I remember a few things, but nothing like it was in other universities.
One big thing that went on a whole lot while in the 60s were panty raids.
Oh, yeah.
Which seems incredible nowadays.
It does, doesn't it? And streaking. Did they have any
streaking? We had people. We had fellows streak from Dallas Hall all the way down to Highland Park Methodist Church.
Oh gosh.
But we had panty raids, and I remember my wife and I, this would happen in the spring when it began to get hot.
Right.
And not all the halls were air conditioned at that time. And there's nothing more miserable than a residence hall.
Oh, so hot because there's no.
It's terrible on the inside. But even the ones that were air conditioned were not all that great. But we would get out and walk the campus at night, and 1 to 3 o'clock in the morning, started feeling the temperature of what was going on, because things could erupt all of a sudden.
Because it was hot, that heat did that. Mm-hmm.
And we had an ally. We had a man, there was a 5 and dime store down on Snyder Plaza, Emmy Moses,
yes. Mm-hmm.
And the manager and I were very good friends. And he would call me if he all of a sudden had a big sale on women's panties. Because we knew that we were going to have a panty raid, because the girls wouldn't throw their good stuff out the window.
Their good silk panties. They had
they'd go down to the dime store.
Moses panties.
So we sometimes we knew something was going to happen.
You could tell.
And we could tell, and then that's hard to believe all that went on, but it did.
And that was all in the 60s? Then things changed?
Yeah, this was in the 60s.
Right. Mm-hmm. What about the Greek life? Did that change a lot
no,
when you were there? Was that, or it was pretty strong?
To me, the SMU Greek life has always been a little bit different than most other campuses. I think I've always felt like that the fraternity system here, both fraternities and sororities, kept the students where they felt more about the fraternity or sorority than they did the university as a whole. You go down to the University of Texas, and the student body as a whole really supports the football team and the baseball.
That's right, and here they
didn't do that. If the fraternities had something going on at the same time a football game was going on, they'd go to the fraternity thing. They wouldn't go to the football game. SMU's always been that way a little bit.
That's interesting, because they're always worrying about apathy and no one going to the games, and maybe that's the source.
I felt like that many times that the fraternities were sort of apathetic toward what was going on in the university.
Just interested in their own.
When I was a student, we had an independent students association, but that sort of just went away.
I remember.
When I came back to work here, that really didn't exist.
That's kind of too bad.
Yeah, it is. It really is sort of too bad. But there were a lot of great people in the fraternities.
I think it's two sides, but that's probably I never heard anyone identify that reason for some of that. That's quite interesting.
I felt that way as a student, as well as later when I worked here. I felt that situation existed.
Yeah.
Now I'm sure there are a lot of fraternity people that would deny that, but I felt that
that's the way you felt. You should.
And I had 2 or 3 opportunities to get in fraternities, and I never did. I just decided I couldn't afford it.
Well, it is expensive.
And it is expensive. And but I had a lot of good friends in fraternities. And so, well.
And okay, so if we look at the residence halls, when were they built? I know the first building on the campus was Dallas Hall, and then obviously Atkins Hall is Clemens Hall.
Atkins Hall was built right after that, and it was for women originally. And it was a beautiful hall. I mean,
it's pretty. I was looking at it after.
When it was originally constructed, it was a beautiful building on the inside. Then Virginia Hall was built in 1927, named after Virginia Johnson. And to this day, I don't know who Virginia Johnson was.
I don't either.
Her picture used to hang in the lobby, and I never could find anybody that knew. Then about a year later, Snyder Hall was constructed. Snyder, Mr. C.W. Snyder from Wichita Falls, didn't donate the building. He loaned the university the money.
Oh.
When I came to work for SMU originally back in the early 50s, I kept a ledger of things that were payable to Mr. Snyder's family. It was a loan, and we paid him, I think $25,000 a year or something like that, as long as he lived. When he died, we paid his wife about $18,000 a year. When she died, we paid his daughter about $7,000 or $8,000.
He ever finished paying? I guess.
Yeah, we finally paid it off. When the family died off, we finally owned it.
Oh, that's good.
So he had a good deal. He was a smart businessman.
That's true.
But yet SMU needed the building at the time.
So they caught. So that because finances were not great.
That's right. The next hall built was, I guess, Peyton Hall. A Mrs. George Peyton from Mahia, Texas, gave that building in memory of her husband. Mr. Peyton was a member of the Board of Trustees, and when he died, she became a member. But she gave Peyton Hall in 1948, I think it was. And it was an elegant building. I mean, I know the first floor bedrooms were all in mahogany, the second floor was all maple, the third floor was all blonde. It was a beautiful building. She had a close friend in Mahia, a lady whose husband had been president of a bank down there, and he had committed suicide. And this lady was left with nothing. I mean, she had nothing. And Mrs. Peyton insisted that she be the first house mother. She wanted to give that woman something to do.
Great.
And her name was Mrs. Blossom Sweat. Blossom Sweat.
That's pretty good.
And she donated the piano that still sits in Peyton. As far as I know, it's still there.
No kidding.
And it's the only good piano we had. It was a real Steinway grand.
The rest of them were kind, yeah.
And it's interesting, the fire screen that's in the fireplace in that building was painted by Mrs. Peyton's brother. Who was an artist living in Austin. And I hope it's still there. I don't know.
I don't know. I think
but that building had some interesting history. When I came back in 57, Bowes Hall had just been constructed. It was built in 1956. Shuttles Hall was built in 1958, and it was named for R.L. Shuttles, who was on the Board of Trustees. I think he was chairman of the board, I think. Mary Hay Hall and McIlvaney Hall were built in 1959 on a loan from the government. And whenever you let the government loan the money, they got you by the hand.
That's true.
That's sort of dangerous to do, but they had to do it. They had to have the buildings.
They had no room for the students.
And they had to have a place for the students. So those two opened in 59. When McIlvaney Hall opened, then the freshmen moved down to McIlvaney. Freshman men moved down there. About that time, Atkins Hall was converted to Clemens Hall and became a classroom building.
Because they had another dorm. They didn't need it anymore.
Well, you don't need the dorms right on the main campus anyway.
No. It would be bad,
most
really.
residence halls are away from the center of the campus. Then in 1964, we built Morrison, McGinnis, Cockrell, and McIntosh. And those were all for men.
That was the end of it.
That was a men's quadrangle.
Okay. And
that's really, I guess, all of. But Letterman Hall, which I think is about to be torn down.
I think so. But
it's got a fence around it. And it was built in 1947. Matty Bell, who was the football coach and the athletic director at that time, built Letterman Hall. He went out. The reason it's called Letterman is because he went out to all the ex-Letterman and collected money from them to pay for it.
Isn't that interesting?
And it was called Letterman's Memorial Dormitory. And it had its own dining room in the
The
basement.
athletes with the
And,
steak.
and the athlete, mainly the football and the basketball players lived there.
Mm-hmm.
And I can remember when I came back in '57, came back in, I guess, August, and it was hot. And Atkins Hall, Bowles Hall was air conditioned, but Letterman was not. It was hot. And it had a terrazzo floor in the living room. And I remember going over, that was the only dining hall open at that point in time, before school started.
Yeah.
And it had to be open for the football team would come in for 2-a-days.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd come in and these football players had been out practicing, and they were all hot, sweaty, and they were all laying with practically nothing on that floor because it was cool. Because it was cool.
Yeah, that's amazing when you think of that SMU is not air conditioned. I know
Well,
even Dallas Hall wasn't air conditioned in 1968.
Fondren Library was built in 1939, and it was the first air conditioned building on campus. We didn't air condition Snyder and Virginia and Peyton till about 1961 or 2.
Wow. Yeah, that's true and I know Dallas Hall wasn't.
Well, Dallas Hall was not.
It was not air conditioned.
None of those buildings were air conditioned.
No.
And that all happened in the 60s. One interesting thing that, going back, Mr. Stanley Patterson, who was the first director of the physical plant, he's the one that created all the tunnel system under the campus, the utility tunnels. I don't think any college in the country had that except he's the one that started it at SMU. And of course that became a big thing to get, the students loved to get down, the boys loved to get down there in the tunnel system
tunnels,
and sneak into the girls' doors.
Oh, God.
And it was dangerous because down there there's steam and electricity.
yeah.
And, you can get electrocuted or burned very
up.
badly. And so you don't really want anybody wandering around in that tunnel system. But Mr. Patterson did that, I guess, in the 20s, maybe early 30s.
They have that at Princeton too, I know. I just read a book where the people are always sneaking down in there, but they almost got killed. A lot of
So anyway, they were able to run the air conditioning system through all the tunnel system.
Pretty easily.
So of course everything is air conditioned from the physical plant. It's an amazing system actually.
Yeah, because that's still, I remember it used to be really freezing in some places and hot in others, depending on how far you were from the, but I think they redid all that. That was many years ago.
Oh,
The Dallas Hall was always freezing cold. And
Yeah.
it was not exactly perfect.
Yeah, when I first came in Dallas Hall, the post office was in the basement of Dallas Hall.
Whoa.
And the men's dining hall was in the basement of Atkins. The women's dining hall was in the basement of Virginia. The infirmary, they called it, was in the east first floor of Virginia. And after World War II, they built the first health center. It was a World War II.
Was that in the same area?
Where it is right now.
Where it is right now.
But it was a temporary building. They got it from an army camp.
In your notes, you talk a little bit about the campus during World War II and all the different, how they moved people out of the dorms and brought in the soldiers and had the barracks and all of that.
That's right. Then after the war, they got barracks. Of course, actually, the student population went from about 1,800 to almost 8,000, 7,900, I think.
Wow.
Just almost overnight. And they brought in barracks from army camps. There were 7 barracks, I think, down around where the business school is now. And they brought in an Army Service Club and put it right across from what is now Clemens Hall, and that was the student union. That was the first student center.
They didn't have a student center.
They didn't have a student. But before then, the only place the students could collect on campus was in Perkins Administration. The first floor of Perkins Administration on the north side was the co-op, which was a soda fountain and a bookstore. That was the first.
That was at Perkins Administration Building.
Yeah. Now Perkins Administration for years was a one-story building. That co-op was on the north side of that first floor, and the registrar and the admissions office was on the south side. There were 2 drugstores over on the Drag. I guess they still call it the Drag.
Hillcrest, yeah.
There were 2 drugstores, the Mustang Drugs, which is where the cleaning shop is now, and the University Drugs, which was
remember that.
where Caldwell is.
Caldwell and Son, yeah, right.
And then when I came back here, I guess back when I came back here in '57, I'm trying to think of the man's name that owned that drugstore.
Remember the drugstore. I
He's a
remember.
billionaire.
I forget his name. Not.
If I could think of his name, my mind.
That's okay.
He's here in Dallas. He's a million in Dallas.
In Dallas.
He owned that drugstore, and I used to go over there and cash my checks, and he would have to okay the checks. And he eventually bought a chain called Ward's Cut Rate Drugstore.
I remember, yeah.
And Harold Simmons.
Oh, that's right, Harold Simmons.
It was
okay.
Harold Simmons. Yeah, Harold Simmons was the manager, the owner of that store.
That's interesting.
That's how he got his start.
Yeah, and now he is a billionaire.
Yeah,
this
he's
is
a
true.
billionaire,
But he
yeah.
still has connection to SMU,
Uh-huh.
grandchildren, children
So,
coming here. So getting back to, let's say we've got all the dorms built, and one thing we talked about on the phone was about the architecture, about the Georgian architecture. You want to talk about that a
SMU
little
is
bit?
one of the few schools in the nation that has stuck with the original architecture. Dallas Hall was a copy of the building at the University of Virginia that Thomas
Monticello.
Jefferson created.
Right.
And the original thing was done by an architect named Brimmer Pond out of Boston, and they've still got his original plans over in the physical plant building. And of course, we've not stuck with them. The way he had it set up, most of the outlying buildings would be similar to Clements Hall.
Okay.
And of course, we haven't stuck with that. But we still have red brick. We still have a lot of stone.
The Georgian stuff.
We still have a lot
Yeah, many columns.
It's really we've stuck with it. It's not like any other school around. We have really stayed that way. I know several years ago I was reading in the Dallas News, they had an article in there from the Atlanta Journal, in which they were talking about coming to Dallas and seeing what was in Dallas. And they talked about SMU, and they said, SMU, you need to go see SMU. It looks like a school designed by Walt Disney.
Isn't that funny? It's so perfect, right?
It's so perfect.
Yeah.
And it really is. I mean, it is a very perfect, it's a very small, this is really a very small campus, as campuses go.
Yeah.
And of course, for the first time since they've built the new buildings over here, the
Laura Lee Blanton
Yeah, the
Student
Blanton-
Service
the
and the
Blanton
Jerry
building-
Junkins
The Blanton building and
Engineering.
the Junkin building are the first, they to me mark the first big departure. They're the first thing where things have really changed. They are creating that east quadrangle. And I think the Blanton building will face down SMU Boulevard and will probably be the main entrance to the campus at some time.
Yeah, well,
I
it's
think that's
supposed to
the
be.
ori- I
They
think
have a
that's the
fountain
intent.
and all this. I
I
think
think-
so.
I
At
believe
that
it.
SMU Boulevard is supposed
And
to
then
go.
Bristol Boulevard will be the ceremonial entrance.
So much. Yeah, right. Those carriages could go down. Could go
So,
down Bishop Boulevard.
At any rate, the architecture we have stuck with the Georgian architecture, even though some of it's very modern, we've still stuck with it, and I think that's good.
Yeah, it is all one of a piece. And of course,
I think
recently we've had
it's a selling point, I think, when people visit here to come to school.
even to have Georgian parking garages.
That's
as
right.
you say.
We've got the only Georgian parking garages in captivity, I think.
I think so, but I think that's good, and it has kept the school small
Yeah.
because the campus is landlocked. We try to buy up as much
Well,
as
of course,
possible.
SMU has been buying up
They
land
have.
between here and Central Express. We own virtually everything between here and the Central Expressway, I believe.
I think so.
And so they've been, when SMU was originally put out here, it was on a hilltop, way out from Dallas. And the university, Mr. Caruth gave SMU the land. He gave SMU the actual campus land, but he gave us half interest in everything from here to what is now Northwest Highway, over to what is now Central Expressway, which at that time was the interurban line,
Okay.
over to the west to I forget which railroad that was, but that's where the toll road is. He gave us half interest in all that land. And so in order to keep going,
You have to
SMU's
sell
always had a financial problem.
I know.
Then
That's what I was going to ask you next.
The history of the school.
It's one crisis after next, but they had to sell off a lot of that,
But
didn't
they had to sell the land off in order to keep going.
That's right.
And that became University Park.
Okay, that's why it was called. Yeah, that all belonged to SMU, and it would have been a huge campus.
That's right. Well, it belonged to SMU and
Caruth,
And
WW.
we got half of everything that we sold. And I know when I first went to work in 1949 in the business office for Leighton Bailey, who was the business manager, I kept a ledger on the property in what is now Preston Center.
Whoa, that was
And we still owned that at that time.
wow.
And they finally sold all of that off in order to build Moody Coliseum. I mean, that's how Moody Coliseum was funded.
Huh. So you know all the secrets. You know all the, well, not the secrets, just how it happened.
Yeah.
And I know what about these financial crises? Do you remember any when you were there that were really bad, that the school almost...
Well, it just seems like we've always needed money. I don't think there ever was one where things were in just desperate circumstances.
Not desperate.
Though during the Great Depression,
right, that must have been cute.
Leighton Bailey, they've credited Leighton Bailey with saving this school. I mean, they really had to cut corners. I know a lot of faculty gave them script. You know, they couldn't pay them. So there were some terrible times during the Great Depression that SMU really had a problem, and had it not been for Leighton Bailey, I think they might have gone under. So.
And SMU as an institution, it has, and I think it has some great desires to be Harvard or Yale or the
I've always called it the Harvard of the South.
Harvard of the South. What do you think about that? Is that
they've talked about that. I don't think the real powers that be have ever felt that way.
No, it's just that what we would like
what
to
the
think.
students and a lot of local people have said that. But, and SMU has tried to be a major university, and I think is.
I think it is, and I think you must feel good to see the changes, or maybe not all put together, but I think it has kept itself going.
The University of Texas at Dallas, in many ways, has got started because of SMU. We had our engineering school, and Eric Johnson and a number of other, I can't think of all the people who ran TI, wanted to do some things.
McDermott,
They wanted to do some things at our School of Engineering. And I'm saying this, I'm not positive of that, but I think Willis Tate, he didn't want them to take over the university. And
he didn't want TI University.
He said no, and they went out and started their own school. And that UTD was originally just a school for graduates.
That's right. That's right.
And I think it was an engineering school principally, I think originally.
It was. I think that was the idea. Now it's become
more. But I think all
of
of that got started because Willis State did not want them to just take over our engineering school. And so they said, we'll just do one of our own. We'll
have our own school. That's the thing. I mean, if you have like the evening school or whatever, the connection of the university.
And SMU at one time had a medical school.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah,
when was that?
I'm trying to think. I think John Hall, who's the registrar.
Yeah, right.
I think he's got the actual thing that says the diploma that was set up at that time for the medical school. Yeah, originally there was a medical school that, in fact, the Southwestern Medical School got its name from SMU, I think.
Really? So that I think they tried to make the connection.
You might talk to John Hall.
I'll have to. All right, somebody will ask about that because
he's got some of the because I have seen the actual diploma that they had printed at that time for the School of Medicine.
So when were you to change the top? But that's really interesting, the different directions the school has gone in. And sometimes people say, well, why did they close down the education school? Well, now they're starting it up again. Why did they not take that from the engineering, from TI? Well, you can see why.
There were
reasons for everything they do, right? There are reasons, and then hindsight's 20/20.
It seems to me that SMU has had the support of SMU by Dallas has sort of ebbed and flowed.
This is true.
Sometimes it's really good, and sometimes it's not so good.
It's not, and it has it's a hard thing to balance the support from the community, and I think now it's pretty good.
I think it is too.
But I think there have been times in the past when different things have happened.
Well, of course, SMU got started. The Methodist Church. It got started when the Methodist Church lost control of Vanderbilt. Did you know Vanderbilt was a Methodist school?
Yeah, I did. But then they didn't want to have it as a Methodist school anymore.
Well, they lost control of Vanderbilt. The local community, I guess, took it over. So they decided to start two new schools. One of them was SMU, and one of them was
Georgetown.
No.
I can't remember the name.
It's in Atlanta.
Emory.
They started Emory, and they started SMU.
To get another Methodist school.
To get two new Methodist institutions. And at that time, that's when they lured Dr. Heyer away from Southwestern University.
That's what I was thinking of, yeah, that he had been
And,
there. I was getting that.
There was a big contest between Fort Worth and Dallas as to who would get the school, and Dallas finally won out.
And
But,
here we are.
and here
What
we are.
happened? Now, you were housing director for how many years? You were, and
Um,
what job, that we haven't really talked about. We've talked about kind of around it, but I want to be sure we get the
Well, let's
chronology.
say Mr. Adams, Mr. Mac C. Adams. Mr. Adams came in '56, I believe it was, and he was the housing director until '63. Then he became director of special services. The special services office handled the housing, fiscal and physical operation, the conference business, and student loans,
Oh,
which was a
student
big
loans, yeah,
job.
I'll bet.
And in that particular situation, Mr. Adams, all of his time was taken up with the loan business. 'Cause that itself is a big operation. Until that time, Dr. Mayne Longnecker, who had been the dean of University Life, had handled the loan business. But Dr. Longer retired, I guess, about that time. And Mr. Adams did, in the Office of Special Services, did the loans. And then Mrs. King did the income production of housing, and I did the
That's
expense
right, you
of,
tell us,
of
okay.
housing. And then after that, Mr. Adams left in 1971, I believe. He went to Austin to take over the student loan business for the state of Texas.
Whoa, that's a job.
He's over all the student loans programs in all the colleges in Texas,
Wow.
and worked for the coordinating board. Well, when he left, Mrs. King was made director of housing, and I was assistant director. She was that from 1971, and she left in '79. She retired and moved to Georgetown, and I became the director of housing.
Okay, and how long did
And I
that?
was that until 1991. And in '91, I retired from the housing operation.
Supposedly, right? But you,
Yeah, well, I did.
You did, you
I
retired from-
retired from the housing operation. And I then went to work for Jim Caswell, the dean. He was the vice president by then, as his assistant, his financial officer. And I stayed in that position until 1998, when I retired completely.
you officially retired
Officially
in
retired.
1998, so that's
So
a
I
long
worked here. I
time.
worked here 42 years.
Wow, that's a lot.
So yeah, Jim Caswell was one of my students. He was one of my freshmen down in Bowes Hall.
What, did he do any naughty stuff, or we won't say?
Oh, he didn't do any more than anybody else.
No
I don't
more than
think.
anybody else. And so that was kind of a nice way to end your career at SMU. But
That
you really
was.
haven't ended it. I mean, you're
I'm over here all the time. Back in the '60s, some faculty and staff people set up an investment club on campus, which is still in operation. And I'm in that club, and I'm the treasurer, which is a big
oh
job.
yes. Did you have to take in all that?
And so I have to handle all the money and everything.
Whoa.
So, and, you know, we meet every 2 weeks and make decisions about investing.
What you're gonna
stock.
invest.
So I have to come over here at least twice a month, sometimes oftener, to handle that business. So I'm on campus quite a bit. But it's gotten to the point that, particularly since the Blanton building's open, I hardly know anybody in Perkins administration. I know Jim Caswell and Bill Detweiler.
And that's about
And somebody in the benefits, that's about the only people I know over there anymore, because everybody's changed.
well, you know, we were saying you need to go over to that Blanton building.
Well, I
and-
need to. I have not been in I used to make it a point to get an ever brand new building, but I have not been in that building. I've not been in the Dedman Science Building.
Oh, you haven't? Oh, that's quite honest.
And so I need to do it. I hear the Blanton building's a beautiful building.
It is. They're all. Everything is really beautiful. Now we've heard that there might be a George W. Bush library coming to campus. Where do you think they should put it?
Well, I wish they would put it more on the campus, but they keep talking about where the Ms. Barrett's plant used to be. I wish they'd put it more closer to the campus.
But they'll need a pretty big.
But I've been suspecting that might happen, you know, since Laura graduated from here, that I'm sure has some sway over George.
I think so, maybe a little bit. Yeah, maybe we could get
So-
that. But the
And since he's already given the
That
Laura
pathway.
Bush look over by
promenade
the
or whatever it is,
library.
yeah.
So I suspect that's true.
You suspect. So if you were still in your job as housing director, I know we talked about how it isn't so popular to live in the dorms anymore.
Not as much. Well, I think today's students, have so much more than the students did back then at home. You have students coming from a home where they have their own room, their own everything.
Exactly.
And then having to come in and share a little cubicle, Well, the 4 buildings that were built in '64, Cockrell, McNaught, Morris, and McGinnis, were not designed. I mean, I helped design those buildings, but I did not like what they did, and it was purely a financial thing. Some of the financial people in the university at that time made the decisions which were out of my hands.
The teeny rooms.
To make the room smaller. And to me, those rooms ought to be single rooms. But you've got to have them double in order to finance them.
That's true.
You've got to pay for them. Because that was all money borrowed from the government, and it's got to be paid back. And the chances are, once that's paid back, they'll make some changes. In fact, they've already made some changes. I haven't been over there recently, but I think they have.
I think they have renovated. They have started to renovate them, and a lot of people are living in single rooms. I still teach here, so
we did some renovation, toward the end of my tenure there, but not enough. Let's see, our offices were in. Well, originally the housing office was at the front desk of Bowes Hall. Originally.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And then we moved over to Perkins Administration. We were on the first floor.
I think I remember.
That's when we were the Office of Special Services, and we handled student loans as well as housing. Then later we moved down to the ground floor, and when I took over, we were on the ground floor of Perkins.
Perkins, so that.
But the young lady who was the director of residence life at that time, she and I decided we needed to move the housing office to Bowes Hall. They were wanting people to move. They wanted to get us out of the administration building. They had other
things they wanted to put in there. Yeah.
And so we made the decision to move the housing office to the first floor of Bowes Hall, which made sense. It's in the center of all the residence
That's right.
halls. And I think that was a wise decision.
That was good.
And so it's on the first floor west end of Bowes Hall.
So I guess
and I suspect we'll stay there for a long time.
That's where it still is there. Yeah. And I guess you've gone from seeing board and tuition being nothing to $35,000.
When I came to school here, I think the semester's tuition was $125.
Oh my God.
Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. That is amazing.
When I first came to school. Then it went up to the $175, I think, before I graduated.
Whoa.
But isn't that amazing?
That is amazing.
It's hard to believe. And of course, that was just tuition. But the room rent was not all that much. It really wasn't all that much.
No, that was just the tuition.
That was just the tuition. But,
right.
But the room rent and the board was not all that terrible.
No, so you could really afford to come. But even that was a lot of money at that time.
Yeah.
But I guess it started to get so high after it had to be in the 70s and 80s. It wasn't.
Of course, I was fortunate because my father was a Methodist minister.
So you had an even cheaper rate or free.
Well, ministers' children got in for nothing.
That's right.
Of any, not just Methodist, any church.
Whoa.
They would welcome the children of ministers of any faith.
For free.
For free.
I don't think they do that
They got
anymore.
a full. Oh no, they don't do that anymore.
No, but so I guess you didn't have much choice about where you were going to go.
Well, I could have gone to another Methodist school.
But that would get you in free too. But
I guess I would have. I don't know.
You're not sure. But
at SMU, that's the way it was.
And it sounds like you've had a really rich career, and you're.
Well, SMU has been a very enjoyable place to work. There are a lot of wonderful people here. There are a few cranks like there are everywhere.
Oh, well, of course.
But there are a lot of very, very nice people at SMU. The great majority of them are.
And you've been able to move from one kind of job to another, and you've had a terrific to
I've
hear
been,
that.
I've been in all sorts of things, yeah.
You have.
And I've had a lot of good friends on the faculty as well as on the staff.
And your investment now, we hope you're.
Well, I hope that club exists. It hasn't been doing too well.
It hasn't. Well,
but when the bottom fell out in the year
right.
2000, we were very high in the technical stocks. And that's where the bottom fell out. But we're coming back, I think.
Well, good.
So I understand that we have a new provost. Is that right?
We do. I've blocked out his name, but he's from Yale. He was and I
understand he's a musician.
That's right.
Isn't that
right.
something?
Yeah, isn't that something?
I didn't even know that. Somebody told me yesterday that they had read that in the Fort Worth Star-Telegram.
Well, it's on the internet too. I saw it. I just saw it, but I've forgotten his name. But that's what they announced, I think, yesterday.
I'm gonna have to log enough to get on there and look and see.
Yeah, it's right in the newspaper thing on the thing, and it says.
When is this going to take place?
Well, I think he'll start in the fall. I think that's
is Dr. Merton leaving the school?
No, he's going to be in the English department. He wants to get back to teaching.
He wants to get back to
teaching.
to
get back to teaching. I think being a provost is very hard work, and he's
it
been
is.
a great
And
one.
it's-
I know they were sorry, but this one sounds great too. They had a good search committee, and here it's
Well, that's great.
it's over.
I'm glad to hear that.
Well, we have enjoyed having you with us so much. It's just been wonderful. What a treasure trove you are of information and stories, and we'll have to get get it all written down, and this will be great too for people
Now,
to see.
what are you going to be doing with all of these interviews that you're doing?
Well, it's the video archive, so they'll be kept in the SMU archive and available for scholars, or and you can have some for your family, and they'll be available so people will understand what SMU was like in the past and up until the present.
Now, and what is your position now?
Well, I'm a senior lecturer in the English department.
You're senior, I see.
So I've been here. I went to SMU too, and I've been here for quite a long time as well. So it's.